Hello, my name is Andrew Moore, the marketing manager for the NI Science Festival. This evening, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Pete Etchells to talk about his brilliant book, Lost in a Good Game, Why We Play Video Games and What They Can Do For Us, in conversation with broadcaster Adam Rutherford. We hope you enjoy.
Hi everybody, the Northern Ireland Science Festival is one of the highlights of the science calendar, and it's breaking our hearts that we're not actually there with you in person, having a few beers and doing this on stage. Next year, or possibly the year after, when lockdown finally ends, we definitely promise we will be there. But it's an enormous pleasure for me to talk to my friend Pete Etchells. He's a professor of psychology at Bath Spa University, and he's also the author of Lost in a Good Game, of which I have 2 copies right here. It's that good.
Me too.
The subtitle is Why We Play Video Games and What They Can Do For Us. Now, this is a absolutely tremendous book. I cannot recommend it enough. It's not just for nerdy gamers such as ourselves, and I imagine quite a lot of the audience watching this, but it's really a much needed exploration of the current status of video games research, the history of gaming, and it's also a personal narrative for Pete as a gamer. Now, when I read it for the first time, I was slightly annoyed that Pete's prose it's so elegant and it's so beautiful and heartfelt, especially for a first-time author. I do distinctly remember thinking, how did he do that? That just doesn't seem fair at all. Now, Pete is also my primary gaming advisor. That's an unofficial role. He is largely responsible for this, which is the latest addition to the Rutherford household, a Christmas present for my 14-year-old son that we built together, and the lighting, as I understand it, does make it work better. Anyway, so it's my great pleasure to talk to Pete, even if it is only over the internet and not in person. So, first question is, what are you playing at the moment?
Do you know, I'm playing loads of mobile games. I don't know why. I'm playing loads of Pokemon Go. I stopped playing it for like 2 years, and then I became like really obsessed with it 2 weeks ago for some reason. And I was playing it last night, and it was like it created a surprisingly tense Sunday evening for me, because there was like 50 minutes left to complete a raid challenge. And if you play Pokemon Go, you might know this already, but you have to wait until a raid randomly pops up near you. And I live in the middle of nowhere, so it doesn't happen that often. And one popped up 20 minutes before I had to finish this challenge, and it was the one that I needed. And then I didn't get it because nobody else was playing. So kind of ruined my Sunday night, really.
And your infant child, how was she faring during this this very important quest?
Just might have forgotten about her for about 5 minutes. No, she was asleep. It was like 8 o'clock in the evening, so it was all good. So yeah, playing that, playing Warcraft when I can. That's always my standard go-to game because it's beautiful. Been playing loads of online board games with people recently. We're playing Codenames and Among Us and things like that.
Yeah. So what's your preferred console or platform? I can see the Switch behind you.
The Switch is the go-to at the minute, actually, because I don't really get that much time to play anymore. And sitting down in front of a TV and having a good gaming session doesn't really happen so much. So that's nice because you can just sort of pick it up and play it for 10 minutes. The thing that I really like about the Switch is that there's like no load times. You switch it on and you're in your game pretty much straight away. So we used to go through this thing a few years ago when I had like half an hour to play a game, and I played Battlefront or something like that, and 27 minutes of that time would be taken up with everything loading up. And I was just sat there going, come on. I could get into the game. Oh, I've got to go now. Yeah. So yeah, that.
Yeah, well, that will be very familiar to gamers of a certain age and reminiscent of the tape loading time and having to listen to that tape player going, and then it crashing. Anyway, let's talk a bit more seriously for just a bit. Let's talk about the book as well, because it is a tremendous book, and I think it is so needed at this time. But tell us about your motivation for writing it in the first place.
Fame and fortune, mostly. That's all I wanted. So yeah. Didn't work, but here we are. So I honestly, probably wrote it for the same reasons that I got into video games research in the first place, which is that there's a lot of stuff out there that's very, very negative and very dismissive of video games. And it's not particularly evidence-based. And also you talk to people who play games and have played them for a long time during their lives. It's not the narrative that you get to understand from people who actually are close to them. And there's a few books out there on games. There's a few generalist books out there on things like screen time, which are all doom and gloom. And it felt like there wasn't really anything out there that was trying to argue for the middle ground. So what usually happens with video games in the media is that, you know, a news study will come out saying that they're melting kids' brains, literally. And that'll pick up a massive amount of traction. And then there'll be a whole slew of articles that are the complete opposite to that, where people are saying, no, this is why they're good. You know, here's my personal experience of how they got me out of a really dark place. And you know, those sorts of stories are important, but like everything in science, right? And you know this as much as anybody, the truth is always somewhere in that really horrible, murky, grey, complex area in the middle. And there wasn't really anything out there that was looking at that was trying to say, let's not kind of get really angry about this or super evangelistic about video games. Let's just look at what they are. Let's look at the evidence and see what we can figure out in terms of what they do to us and why we play them and all those sorts of things.
But there's also a strong personal narrative in there. As a gamer, you don't approach this subject as someone who's absolutely neutral on video games. It's not an area of psychology that you've got into by chance. This is a big part, like for so many people, it's a big part of your life.
Yeah, definitely. And so I talk about this a lot in the book. There's a weird sort of thread in the minds of a lot of people who research video games, in that you've got to be really evangelistic and pure about it. So it's a quote from a colleague that I talk about in the book, where he says, you know, he went to this conference once and somebody introduced themselves and said, you know, I'm a video games researcher, but I don't play games. And it's a really weird thing to say, right? That's kind of like a music researcher saying, you know, I do music research, but I don't listen to anything. Or a food researcher saying, I do research on nutrition, but I don't eat. It's okay to play video. And actually, interestingly, the detritus that is Twitter, I've had arguments with people before where they said, you know, you've got a real conflict of interest in research on video games because you play them. I'm a person, I'm a human, I have hobbies and things like that. And, you know, I hope that I'm a good enough scientist that I can leave that at the door when I do research, right? And not allow those sorts of biases to creep in. And there's all sorts of cool, nerdy ways in which we can do that, which I talk about in the book. But yeah, I'm not 100% neutral about this. And I don't think anybody should be. I think it's important that you have somebody who knows what they're talking about in terms of the lived experience of video games to be able to say, look, this is actually what happens when you sit down and play them for a bit. It's not that bad.
Right. And like you said a minute ago, a lot of the motivation for this was the profoundly disappointing and often sort of tedious media narrative. This is one of the reasons why, I mean, this is basically how we met and subsequently became co-authors and friends and ultimately mortal enemies. But the representation of video games and gamers in particular in the media has been particularly pernicious, even amongst the sort of domain of dodgy science reporting. So you sort of track the trajectory of this, particularly from the 90s onwards. Just give us a flavor of the standard tone in terms of talking about gamers and gaming research.
So the story, the news headline that got me into this research area in the first place was 2011. I think it was. Computer games leave children with dementia, warns top neurologist. It's ingrained in my head, that headline. Annoying for a number of reasons. One, the person who was saying it is not a top neurologist. They were a neuroscientist and they're different things. And the second thing is that there is literally no evidence to suggest that that's the case. You know, it certainly wasn't any evidence at that particular point in time. There's been no emerging evidence since that if you play video games, it's going to leave you with extremely early onset dementia. And it seemed born out of the same reason that we see all these really frustrating media narratives around video games. It seems born out of this idea that people are worried about them, and that's fine. It's okay to be worried about things, but they don't get them. And you can kind of understand it in a way. If you watch somebody playing a video game, having never played one yourself before, it's quite a disconcerting experience. You know, if you watch a kid playing Minecraft or something like that, they really do look like they're glued to their screen, and their brains might literally start leaking out of their ears at any point. And if you don't have any understanding of how that environment works, that looks like a scary thing. And then you couple it with the fact that, you know, everybody's got lived experience of screen technology now, and everybody has this sort of personal anecdotal opinion about, you know, oh, everybody's on the tube just looking at their phones and not connecting with each other. You know, these things must be bad for us. It's that sort of narrative that seems to capture people in, and it seems to be the thing that a lot of journalists like. You know, we saw it this past week. There was a big thing in the news this past week about people being worried about screen time skyrocketing during the pandemic over the past year, and that inherently in that, and it's not sort of explicitly stated, but it's this undercurrent that that's a bad thing. You know, that too much screen time is an unwholesome activity. Playing video games too much is not a natural thing to do. And the thing that sort of often spouted is this idea that, you know, why are you playing video games when you could be outside having fun instead? As though those two things have to be mutually exclusive, and they're not. And I often feel it's quite a privileged view of how we live our lives and how kids play, right? Because yeah, it's great playing outside if you've got a place and a safe space to do that. A lot of kids don't. And actually for a lot of kids, it's much safer for them to be inside and connect with friends and stuff over the internet rather than play out in the streets. And that's the sort of thing that gets missed. We look at video games as though they're very isolating experiences. And historically, this is how they were always viewed, particularly in the 90s. They were seen as this very isolating experience. You know, it's always a pasty white male teenager in their room on their own, just playing video games and not talking to anybody. And video games are not that. They are one of the best ways that we can connect with each other. I'm sure a lot of people have realized this over the past year or so, that, you know, they're a fantastic way of connecting with people who you immediately share a common interest with because you're playing the same game as each other. But the thing about video games is that they've always been like that. You can trace competitive games where people are playing with and against each other back to the late 60s. You know, they've always had that ingrained in them. We've just never really noticed it.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be a really sort of striking disconnect between the media representation of gamers and as you say, what we actually do. And, you know, my experiences in the 90s at university, where I was in a hall which had basically the first internet connection for University College London. And one of my friends, we played online together in his bedroom with 4 or 5 of us, or before that, we'd be playing most nights for at least 7 hours Mario Karts. These are inherently social activities. And also, you know, the penetrance of video games in the market is absolutely enormous. So I'm always completely baffled why there is such a sort of media fear of this thing that basically almost everyone does. Just tell us some of the stats about the penetrance of the gaming market. You know, how big is it? What is it worth? Who plays? What do we know about the demographics of gamers?
It's like 2.5 billion people worldwide, I think, play video games. Not many, yeah. Interestingly, I think sort of in terms, so this is one of the things that I cover in the book in that, you know, I do in the before times, BC, before COVID, I did a lot of talks on this sort of stuff. And one of the questions I always ask the audience is, you know, who's a gamer out there who plays video games? And, you know, not that many people put their hands up. And then you say things like, well, you know, who plays Candy Crush on their phone or Pocket City? And then people start sticking their hand up. And there's sort of perception of a gamer as somebody who plays something like Call of Duty or Battlefront or Fortnite and things like that. But actually, a lot of people play games on their phones nowadays. I think it's like 60% of digital gaming is via mobile now. In terms of like the demographics, on average, the sort of the people who play games the most are people in our age group. It tends to be men aged sort of 30 to 40-ish. I think more women over the age of 50 play video games, depending on what your definition of video games is, than boys in their early teens, which is sort of not something that you would necessarily expect. But it goes back to this idea of how do you define video games? How do you define somebody who plays them? And this sort of almost special category of gamer is something that has very specific connotations to a lot of people that you either very strongly identify with or you don't. And if you don't, then the sort of assumption is you don't play video games at all, when actually video game is a garbage term, right? It doesn't make sense anymore. I mean, who knows what a video is anymore? You try and replace it with something like digital games or electronic games, and electronic games to me immediately conjures up things like Game and Watch and stuff like that. So we don't really have a good vocabulary to talk about video games, which is part of the problem as to why people don't understand them. But you asked me for some stats. So about $260 billion. That's going to be the global gaming market in the next 2 to 3 years. I think the interesting one for me is that if you look at esports, so people watching other people play competitive games, that's got an audience at the minute of around about 500 million people worldwide. And that's an interesting one as well. Like if you talk to people about, so there's this whole phenomenon of things called Let's Plays. You go into YouTube and Google Let's Play. Basically, they're videos of people playing a game. And the whole point of that video is just for you to watch somebody do that for a bit. You try and explain this to people and their eyes glaze over and they're like, why would you do that? Which is interesting in one way, because it suggests that they understand what the point of a video game is. It's to immerse yourself in that experience. It's interesting in another way because you don't say the same thing about going to a football match. Nobody goes, why the hell would you go and watch a bunch of grown men or women kick a ball around the field for 90 minutes? It's just go and play it yourself. But it's the same reason as to why we enjoy watching football that people enjoy watching esports, which is that we really enjoy watching people do something that we like and love at an expert level, right? And games are no different in that sort of sense.
And that has been going on since the beginning of video games. Since the 70s, there were public competitive matches, and it became a huge, a huge spectator sport with professional gamers, making entire careers out of this. I think about how my relationship with games has changed over the years, and this sort of reflects how games have developed. So now my son sits here and he likes the game he finished yesterday was the new Spider-Man on the PS4, Miles Morales. Nice. Now, when I talk to you and ask you things about these games, I'm actually not really playing them myself. I'm actually watching him, because the narrative setup in this game, which costs X 100 million to make, and probably more than the equivalent movie, it's Spider-Man Miles Morales on the PS4 is better than at least 4 of the Spider-Man movies. And so that's a nice way for me to spend time with my son while he's doing something exceptional, and we talk about the things that interest us, which happen to be Spider-Man. So anyway, that wasn't really a question. I think about how the media representation of games, as you said, it's so often, some loner, some pasty-faced teenage boy who's very disconnected from reality, playing probably Call of Duty. And it makes me, I recall in 2012 when the Sandy Hook shootings, Adam Lanza was a guy who shot 26 children and himself on that day. The first thing reported in the media was that he had been playing Call of Duty. I think it would have been 4 or 5 at that time. They didn't mention that his favorite game was actually Dance Dance Revolution. And this was a big part of the narrative. You play video games, you play violent video games, shoot 'em ups, and it makes you violent. What's the science behind that sort of claim in the media?
So I think oftentimes this sort of represents a failure in science communication. And it's something that I kind of experienced myself over the past few years, in that if you work closely with the media, then you get to know how that ecosystem works. And you become an expert, a go-to expert. People know that you're reliable because you'll respond quickly, or you'll be able to say something meaningful and useful about that particular thing. But inevitably what happens is that something comes along where you're not quite an expert in it, or you're not an expert at all, but maybe you feel a bit of pressure to say something because you've sort of built up this expectation that you can do this, and journalists may be just looking for an expert opinion, and this is where things start to go wrong. Just because somebody's a professor of whatever doesn't mean that they know loads about everything. And I think we have to be very careful about that sort of failure in critical thinking sometimes, where we just see, Professor Etchells says that COVID is going to go away in 6 months, is a ludicrous thing to say. I know nothing about COVID, right? And that's not my area. But there's almost like an air of authority around the fact that I'm a neuroscientist or a psychologist or a professor or something like that. And it might be one of those cases where you're talking to somebody about video games, and then they just throw in a sort of a curveball question around this thing. You feel like you need to answer it. And I noticed that with things like the Sandy Hook shootings, in that there were people who were very eminent researchers in things like criminology, who started saying things about why he did this, why he shot so many people, and how this might be tied to video games. And say things like, he didn't see those people as people, he saw them as trophies. And because if you play a violent video game, you don't see the other people that you're killing as people, you see them as pixels on a screen, yada yada yada. And that's a load of nonsense, because the first thing to say about that is that you can't make claims about what's going on inside somebody's head if you've not even been in the same country as them. And we see this a lot in the media around almost like sort of diagnosing from a distance. And I understand it partly because when these really horrible things happen, these sort of mass acts of violence, we want to know why did this happen? How do we stop it from happening again? There's always sort of scrabbling around in the immediate aftermath for answers. That's the most dangerous point at which you can start saying, oh, well, I think it's this. And as you point out, the narrative that came out around Sandy Hook at the time was that Lanza played Call of Duty. And I think there was one headline that, the day before he was playing it for like 18 hours straight. The explicit link is not made, but implicitly in all of these stories is the idea that it's not just that he played video games that led to this, it's because he played video games. And it was only after a very detailed, I think it was 9-month forensic analysis, that it then came out that actually, yeah, he played quite a lot of Call of Duty, but he played vastly more Dance Dance Revolution. And making that link, saying playing Dance Dance Revolution causes mass acts of societal violence, doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. You make that claim in the news and everybody go, no, that's rubbish. So there's that kind of whole narrative that causes this issue. The second issue, which again is sort of a failure in science communications, failure in doing science really, is that in psychology over the past 10 years or so, we've been going through this revolution in terms of what's known as the replication crisis. So about 10 years ago, a few things, I won't go into details about them, but they're all in the book. A few things happened all at the same time that made psychologists think, ooh, are we doing all of this wrong? None of our studies replicate, and all of these really big, important classical findings that we thought were solid, turns out that they're just falling away to dust. if you look at different areas of science, you see some of these problems happen in different places. Maybe you see more of them happen in psychology, but I've always thought that if you like zoom in to video games research in psychology, you find all of the issues in the same place. And violent video games research is a really good example of this. You know, we've had 30 years of research trying to look at this association between playing violent video games and aggression. And it's been a tremendous waste of time and effort, because actually we've got to the point now where we're doing really good studies. They're open science, all the data is available, they're all pre-registered, so no preconceived biases about what you expect the data to show can creep in. And all of those really good studies suggest that, you know, there might be a weaker association there, but it's not really anything to worry about. You rewind 15 years or so ago, and you look at the big meta-analyses in this area, a lot of stuff was saying there's definitely a causal link between playing a violent video game and aggression. What changed? Well, we sort of realized that the studies that we were doing were all a bit rubbish, basically. It's really hard to test aggression in the lab. So if we kind of go back to the Sandy Hook massacre as an example, you know, the question that you're trying to answer is, are there certain games out there that if you play them, or if certain people play them, they are at higher risk of going out and shooting a load of people? That's a really important question to ask, right? So it's got obvious societal consequences, and we would want to know that. How do you test that in the lab? Well, you get people to play some violent games or some non-violent games, and then you give them an aggression measure afterwards, and you see whether the violent games group are more aggressive than the non-violent games group. What's your aggression measure? Well, if you want it to be as close to that big question as possible, maybe it's something like you stick a bunch of people in a room with a gun and see how many people come out alive, right? And maybe your working hypothesis is that in the violent games condition, fewer people will be alive in the room afterwards. Now, I think that is not an ethical study to do. So I really hope nobody's done it. Yeah, there are very immediately you can see what the problems are in terms of, you know, what do you mean by aggression? What's your measure of aggression? What's your ethical measure of aggression that you can test in the lab? And this is the problem with violent games research. It's that past 10, 15 years, the biggest or the most widely used measure is something called the competitive reaction time task. This is kind of super nerdy, so I'll try and say it as quickly as I can. Competitive reaction time task, you get people to play a violent game or a non-violent game, and then you say to them, okay, right, we're going to go and play a different game now in a different room. I'm going to sit you in this room on your own with a computer, and there's somebody else somewhere in the university who's at a similar computer. I'm going to play a reaction time game. So at some point, something's going to appear on the screen, like a red blob or Yoshi or whatever. As soon as you see it, you got to press the space bar, right? Same thing's going to happen to the other person. If they press the space bar before you, so if they're faster, they win, you lose. Vice versa, if you press it quickest, you win, they lose. And critically, whoever wins gets to punish their opponent. So they get to blast them with a loud noise. And you get to decide how loud the blast is and how long the blast is for. And that's your aggression measure. So first immediate problem is blasting somebody with a loud noise, because you just beat them in a reaction time game. Kind of aggressive, but it's very different to the kinds of mass acts of societal violence that we're talking about. Second thing is, actually there's two measures there, duration and loudness, right? So which one do you use? And this is where the entire research literature becomes an absolute dumpster fire, because some people use the average duration, some people use the average loudness, some people use the average duration times the average loudness, some people use the square root of the average duration times the loudness. Some people only take the data from the trials where you won, having lost the previous trial. You might call that retaliatory aggression. Some people only use the data from the very first trial from the study and dump everything else, because that's the only time that you can guarantee having won, having never lost before. So you might call that unprovoked aggression. The other person doesn't exist in this scenario. It's all controlled by the computer, so you can manipulate how many times people win or lose. But there's a really important study that came out a few years ago that took it took 3 data sets, actually. It took three actual data sets, and it analyzed them in all these different ways. So it took all of these different combinations of how you decide what your aggression measure is. And it found that basically using exactly the same data set, you can show anything you want. You can show that violent video games definitely do cause aggression, violent video games definitely don't cause aggression, or inconclusive results. So it's all about, so it's nothing to do with the data, it's all about the decisions that you make about what to do with the data. And if you're making those as you're analyzing the data, and you have a preconceived bias for video games or against video games or whatever, that's inevitably going to creep in and skew the results.
Right.
And that's why it's all a mess.
Yeah, sure, which is often the case in studying humans. It's just that not all, I guess, the outcome isn't always so controversial or so leapt upon by the press, or as you say, it's an area where all of the problems in psychology appear to be massively amplified. Now, there is one form of scientific study of people which is potentially a way around this, which is to use prospective data sets that have already been captured. And have there been any interesting, exciting papers with middle tier results that have been published using that technique with the authors Etchell and Rutherford and Gage?
Any good papers? No. Yeah, no. So this is another way of looking at it, right? And this is what we did a few years ago. So you can take longitudinal data sets, so data sets where you track people over time and just let them go about their daily business. Some of them will play violent video games, some of them won't, some of them will play other sorts of video games, others won't. And over time, some of them might become actually aggressive. So they might display signs of something like conduct disorder, where they're kind of retaliating against authority. They're going out and setting fire to things, or they're beating each other up and all of those sorts of things. So you're not actively manipulating that, you're just letting people live their lives and passively collecting data on that. And that's a really powerful way of getting around some of these experimental issues, in that you can look at what we think of as sort of actual aggression, actual violence, and you can look at that in the context of what sort of games people play. They're really tricky studies to do because you're just letting people do whatever they want with their lives. And the study that we did was we looked at video game use at age 8, 9, and aggressive outcomes in terms of conduct disorder at age 15, 16. There's all sorts of things that can impact on whether somebody begins to show signs of conduct disorder at age 15, 16 that have nothing to do with video games. Things like the family environment, childhood trauma, what their peers are like, all of those sorts of things. So the trick with longitudinal studies is that you've got to try and account for as many things as possible that you might think also might have an impact on your findings, so that you can be more sure that the thing that you're interested in, the thing you care about, is the thing that's driving any sorts of effects. So the thing that we've got to be careful about with longitudinal studies by and large is that it's very difficult to infer causal associations. So if you show, as we did in our study, that if people play more violent video games age 8 or 9, they're slightly more likely to show increased levels of aggression at age 15, 16. You can't say that, well, it's therefore because they played those violent video games. And actually, we showed this, I think, I'm biased obviously, but I think we showed this quite nicely in our paper, in that we looked at other things instead. So, we looked at competitiveness in video games. And when you take into account things like that, the effects of violent video games start to disappear. So there are all sorts of other reasons why people might become more aggressive at age 15, 16, and it might not be due to video games. One of the big take-home messages from our study was that there is an association there. It's really weak. It's probably not worth worrying about. We tested, what did we test? We had something like 1,800 participants in the end. I think once we kind of removed people who didn't have full data sets and stuff. You're muted, Adam.
Oh yeah, I think it was more like, from memory, I think it was like 2,300, something like that. But when we started off with
something like that,
a data set of like 8,000, and then
removing
all of the confounding, it was down to around about 2,000. Yeah.
The important number, I think, was that 30 participants made the case criteria for conduct disorder after that. So the absolute risk of this is tiny. Yeah. And there have been other studies that have been done since then that have been pre-registered and use open data and show similar things, that there might be some small associations there, but actually if we're thinking about these in terms of meaningful effects, then they're not worth worrying about.
Yeah, and I suppose fits into a longer narrative about general technophobia, about new technologies which are causing the youth of today to wildly disagree with their parents, something which has been happening in recorded history since at least Socrates' time, who complains really, really vociferously about his students using pencils to write things down, because if they write things down, they won't use their memory. So this is, I mean, it is as old as time. In the generation before us, it was video nasties, and, watching violent horror films. But I suppose one of the points about, we've been talking about the Adam Lanza shootings in Sandy Hook, but I think more generally is that so many people play video games broadly, and so many people within those categories play what we would class as, or what those types of studies class as violent video games, such as Call of Duty, that statistically the number of people who then go on to cause mass shootings or acts of societal violence is actually not significant at all. I mean, it's pretty non-existent. I think that Call of Duty, the one that Adam Lanza played that year, had sold something like 15 million copies by the time those shootings occurred, meaning that, well, effectively all school shooters will have played Call of Duty, but the other way around is the more interesting statistic, which is that almost no Call of Duty players ended up shooting up a school.
Yeah, this is so. And to my mind, the interesting news story would be one in which somebody undertakes a school shooting who doesn't play video games. They're the people who don't seem to exist, because so many people play them. Like you say, if it was the case that this association was causal and it was as strong as was claimed 10-15 years ago, there would not be 2.5 billion people playing video games nowadays, because there probably wouldn't be 2.5 billion people. So yeah, and I guess part of it goes back to this idea, you sort of brought it up a minute ago, how we define this, right? So talked about how you define aggression in the lab, and that's problematic. But actually, violent video game is a meaningless term as well. Pretty much. And so one of my favorite examples of this was a study that came out, I think in 2001, where some scientists tried to sort of quantify the levels of violence in video games. And they basically kind of came up with a list of violent, percent violent content in games. The most, I think Donkey Kong came pretty high up. I think that was something like, I can't remember the specific numbers, it was like 75%. The most violent game that came out of it was Centipede. Do you remember Centipede?
Do I
Centipede
remember
was a brilliant
Centipede?
game.
Patronize me.
So it came out before a lot of people who were watching this are probably born, but I love Centipede because it's got a really good, it's got one of those, if you play it in the arcade, and there's a few arcades that still have them, but we're not.
We should explain what Centipede is. It's basically Space Invaders, but the Centipede would just file down the screen and you'd have to shoot every element of his body. Yeah,
and like when you shot a bit of its body, I think it turned into a mushroom, so that created a barrier. So its sort of path through was a bit more random than in Space Invaders. That is not a violent game, right? Just because you're shooting something, we could argue for days whether you think that's violent, but that, to me, that's not a violent video game. But you look at things like what happened in Norway about 10 years ago. Anders Breivik, who was the perpetrator of that massacre. So games like Call of Duty and World of Warcraft were linked to that. And that's always been an interesting connection for me, and that if you go back 10 years, not so many people play Warcraft anymore, but if you go back 10 years and you ask people, name a violent video game, they would say something like Call of Duty, or they'd say something like Warcraft. Right? From a scientific perspective, for somebody trying to study this in lab, those two games could not be more different from each other. If you think about it purely in terms of, I'm a vision nerd by trade. That was what my PhD was in, vision science. And if you look at how attention is focused in those games, they're completely different. So one's a first-person shooter, one's a third-person perspective online role-playing game. Call of Duty, your focus is always directed, your attention is always directed to the center of the screen, because that's where your gun's pointing and that's where all the action happens. There's a map in the corner, there's a score count in another corner, but they're kind of fairly peripheral things. Right? Warcraft is completely the opposite. Like your person is in the middle of the screen, but there's so much other stuff going on around the outside. You've got to kind of pay attention to the action bar that's happening at the bottom, because you've got to be able to press buttons to perform actions in the right sort of timings to sort of maximize your damage output. You've got to watch what's happening with the rest of your group in the chat, because they might kind of be doing things that mean that you need to get out of the way of something. You're looking at everything apart from where that sort of violent act is being directed. But in pretty much all research on this topic, they would be treated as the same game effectively. And we've never really got past that. We've never really got to a point where we categorize games at such a fine-grained level that we can make those meaningful distinctions between those to see what the effects are. You know, and this was a problem with our study as well, right? So we tried to categorize games by genre, but even then, that's not perfect, right? So we were looking at data from 1998. So they were asking things like, do you play shoot 'em ups? Well, we assumed in that people who play GoldenEye 64 would say yes to that. But actually, a shoot 'em up to me is a completely different type of game. So how we categorize them is so nebulous and so fluid. And if you take a single game, you could categorize it in so many different ways. Fortnite's a great example of this. Like, how do you categorize Fortnite? Oh, it's a violent shooting game because that's what you do. It's also a social media network because most people basically use it as a glorified form of Twitter. It's a creative game because you can go around building things. You know, it doesn't fit any of these categories neatly. So if you try and shoehorn it into one and find an effect, what does that mean? Nobody knows.
So I mean, I'm trying to draw a comparison with other forms of media which have been which have been criticized over the years, and I think, you know, the obvious example is cinema, but we don't even do that anymore. You know, we don't categorize. We try to categorize films as horror, but in terms of research about their impact, it is basically, I think people have effectively given up trying to say that this is an area which is more problematic than another area. Do you think that maybe is what's going to happen in gaming research? That actually,
I think so. Yeah, and I think in terms of the public narrative, the public discussions around video games, it will inevitably mature as people who played them when they were young grow up and become adults and parents and eventually grandparents, and we see generations of people who are very kind of personally familiar with video games. That sort of narrative will change, I think. I get a completely anecdotal feeling, but a feeling nevertheless that actually that not so much from a scientific perspective, but from that kind of general public perspective, that there's been a shift like that already over the past year or so. You know, so we've sort of tried to come to grips with this idea of, you know, we're all in our homes, we've got to find things to do, invariably in front of a screen. You know, for better or worse, it's brought people who maybe didn't engage with video games before. It's sort of forcibly brought them into the fray, as, you know, maybe they've had to deal with, you know, their kids playing them and wanting to play them at times that you don't want to play them. But because it's so intense and you have to spend so much time in that sort of situation, inevitably you kind of get to know a little bit more about what those games are. And that sort of understanding, I think, could be really useful. When parents worry about the effects that video games have, it's very easy to suggest, well, you know, if you don't play them, maybe you should try them for a bit and try playing them with your kids. I find that's a very difficult thing to do, because I think a lot of advice for parents is, well, if you don't do that thing, maybe you should try doing it. And yeah, there's only so much time in the day to be doing things, and not everybody wants to play games. That's fine. So it's difficult, but, you know, just having that almost kind of passive experience of what they might be like, I think maybe shifts people's opinions and perspectives on what their utility is.
So look, we're running out of time, but we've talked a lot about the sort of negative, the criticisms made, spurious though they often are and pernicious though they often are. But what about the research into the positive aspects of gaming? What can gaming do for your teenage daughter or son, or for us as slowly decaying adults? You know, what positive aspects can gaming bring?
So I think earlier I said that, you know, the sort of 30 years of research on video games and aggression has been a tremendous waste of time. And part of the reason that I say that is that I think, you know, 90% of research, psychological research on video games, is about that question, or about whether they're addictive or not. And what that's meant is that all of those really interesting questions about, well, you know, what are the nuanced benefits of them? There is some out there, but there's not much. And I'm sort of equally dubious about a lot of the claims about the positive effects of games as I am the negative effects. So brain training is a classic example of this. Brain training games like, was it Dr. Kawashima's brain training for the Nintendo DS? That's an interesting one, actually, because there were a few claims at the time that, you know, if you play this, it'll improve your memory, and it might even stave off dementia. And actually, Nintendo distanced themselves from that and said, you know, this hasn't been studied, and we're not making those claims, and we wouldn't recommend that your doctor prescribe this to you. Quite rightly, because, you know, we've seen a bunch of brain training apps come out on mobiles over the past few years, and I can't remember the name of it. Lumosity got successfully sued by the FDA a few years ago because they were making quite grandiose claims about whether, you know, this could improve your grades and things like that if you play these sort of memory games every now and again. So there's no kind of overt benefits in that sense that I'm really convinced by, and that, you know, that kind of makes sense if we're arguing that, you know, if you play a violent video game, it's not going to make you aggressive, but if you play a memory game, it will improve your memory. You know, those are, you know, slightly at odds with each other. Where the benefits
when I play memory games, I tend to get much more violent. Different reasons.
So the other area that's vastly missed out from all of this is board games research. I am 100% convinced that if you did a study of Monopoly, you would find the same levels of aggression from people who play Monopoly as you do with violent video games. But we'll have to leave that one until we can get back into the lab.
Okay, well, let me ask you a question then, because I like asking scientists this question. So I'm going to give you of the outstanding questions that need to be asked and addressed in a proper scientific way associated with gaming research, psychology, and its impact on people. I'm giving you a £1 billion grant, and you can design any experiment that you want within ethical constraints. What are the types of questions, and how would you design your experiment?
Do you know what? They're really boring questions, but they're really important ones because we don't know the answer to them. And I think the most fundamental one is, why do we play games? You know, what do we get out of them? I mean, obviously it's the tagline of my book, so I kind of tackle it in there, but the unfulfilling answer to that is that because of a few inadvertent screw-ups in the way that we did research on that question over the past 20 years or so, we don't actually really know why people play them. A lot of research instead focused on gaming archetypes. So sort of say things like people either fall into the categories of being explorers, so they like kind of looking around and exploring their environments. They like they're achievement hunters, so they like getting trophies and stuff. They're socializers, or they're griefers, so they're just basically bastards who go around just killing everybody for the fun of it. But the trouble is, a lot of research on that question uses questionnaires, and they ask questions like, do you like socializing in games? So if you tick 10 to that, then you're categorized as a socializer. So they're kind of self-fulfilling, really. And actually, you know, if you look at how people play games, so talk about my own perspective on this in the book. So I think Warcraft is the example that I use. So I first started playing Warcraft about 10 years ago, and I started playing that. I realize I'm not answering your question, but there's a good reason. So 10 years ago, I started playing Warcraft because I was a bit bored and I wanted to try a new game. A couple of years in, I was part of a guild. So primarily the reason that I was playing was because I wanted to catch up with my mates. A few years after that, there was a certain sort of task that I wanted to get done. So I was like really trying to get that achievement. The big story that I talk about in the early chapters of my book is I was playing it a few years ago, and I wasn't really playing it. I was just sort of sitting there on a mountaintop waiting for a dragon to appear that's called the Time Lost Proto Drake, and it's called that because it basically never appears. But the reason that I was playing it then was that it was the anniversary of my dad's death. He died 20 years before, and I was having a bit of a rubbish time, and I just kind of wanted to escape for a little bit. Now, how you categorize that from a research perspective, you know, if you ask me the question, why do you play Warcraft? I mean, I had to write a book about it. That's partly why I wrote it. That's my kind of answer to the why question. But there's got to be a better way of tackling that. And I think it more fundamentally goes back to a more general question around the nature of play. So there've been decades and decades of research looking at sort of these more traditional forms of play. And we know that it's a really important thing to do from a childhood development perspective in terms of learning rules and learning how to socialize and all of those sorts of things. There's a lot of books on play that are very negative about video games. So they're like, play's really important. Don't play video games. They're really bad for you, but play's really important. So the really big question is in trying to answer that, like, why do we play games question, what I'd like to do is try and understand at a more fundamental level the nature of digital play, not just for kids so much, but for adults as well. I don't know how I would do that yet. It would probably end up being some rubbish questionnaires to begin with, but questionnaires are rubbish for all sorts of reasons. But I think, you know, if you gave me infinite resources, I think what I'd really like to do is do a major tracking study. It would have to be like a major longitudinal study, but with video games as a particular focus. So we can ask really detailed questions about what people are doing, what games people are playing, and when and how and who with. And we can get really fine-grained data over time. It would be a GDPR nightmare, because it's essentially me saying, what I would like to do is put a tracker on your phone, and every time you play a game, it captures everything about everything that you do in the game. But the thing is that even then it's problematic, because, you know, we talked about this already. You've been playing on the PS4, I've been playing on the Switch, I've been playing on my mobile. So how do you bring all of those disparate ways to play together to kind of come to a coherent whole about what the nature of play is and how it affects us? So I guess the really boring answer to it is trying to figure out how to do that to begin with before we actually go ahead and do it.
Yeah, well, I don't have £1 billion, so you're gonna have to work out how to do that on the cheap anyway. There's a current project a current project that you're working on, which is the and also a shout out for which is that you want to find out about people's experiences with loot boxes. Now, I don't tend to play the types of games where loot boxes were a thing, so perhaps some of the audience might not know. But just briefly tell us what the loot box phenomenon is and what you're asking for.
So the closest analogy I can think of is, do you remember Panini sticker albums in the early 90s? Yes. Where you get like the Premier League sticker album, you buy a packet of stickers and you didn't know what stickers were in there. You would get 1 million Oldham Athletic emblems because it was, you know, a common one and everybody had that, so it wasn't particularly valuable. But everybody really wanted the shiny, sparkly Man United emblem because you very rarely got that. So basically there's a tier system of stickers. Some are really common, some are rarer, some are super rare. And inherent in that process, the super rare things become more desirable. Right? Loot boxes are a digital version of that, basically. So within a given game, say every time you level up, you get a box to open, and that can contain a random assortment of stuff. Usually it's things like in-game currency or in-game stickers that you can put on walls in the gaming environment, or it's outfits for your character. And some of them are really common, so nobody cares about those. Some of them are super rare. They're called legendary outfits, and people really want those. So where the kind of analogy falls down is that, you know, there's a certain amount of effort that's involved in going down to your newsagents and spending your pocket money, you know, real hard, cold hard cash, and getting something physical back, and then, you know, having to do that again the week after. Whereas with digital loot boxes, you can just click a button, you can keep clicking the button. So the time between sort of doing something and getting the reward is much quicker. And we know that from decades of research in learning psychology, if you pair a stimulus with a reward much more closely in time, then they become much more strongly associated with each other. So there's a real worry at the minute that basically loot boxes are addictive, effectively. And there's some emerging research to suggest that that might be the case. I'm sort of sitting on the fence at the minute in terms of trying to maintain a critical thinking hat on this, because a lot of the data that we've got at the minute is correlational, and we've not got any of those sort of good long-term studies that look at this in terms of causal association. So it's kind of what I'm trying to do with the study that I'm doing at the minute. It's questionnaires are rubbish, but it's the best that we've got, particularly in pandemic times. But I'm using some super nerdy, nifty statistics to look at sort of strength of evidence. So if we can see associations between how much you play video games, how often you buy loot boxes, how do you feel when you buy loot boxes, is there an association there? How strong is that association, and is it actually a meaningful effect? Those are the sorts of things that I'm looking at or trying to look at.
And how do people get involved with that?
So there's a survey link, and I can't remember where I put it. But if you contact me on Twitter,
we'll put it down at the bottom if we can do that. I don't know.
It'll be on a page somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wrote an article for Science Focus before Christmas, and the links and stuff are in there. If you Google loot boxes Pete Etchells, then you'll be able to find it. I need 5,000 participants, and to date I've had about 250. So by the time this actually goes out live, I probably will have got 250 participants. So I'm sort of desperate for as many people.
We'll push it out on everyone's channels and try and get that number up to being statistically significant. All right, before we go, let's just do a quick fire round.
Go for it.
Okay, what's your earliest gaming memory?
Playing a game on the Atari 520, which I can't remember the name of now, but I'm sure I was playing it wrong because it was like a space simulation game, and all I remember was flying through a star field, and you turn the joystick and you move the star field a bit, but I couldn't figure out how to do anything else in the game other than that. Do you know what? It was the best thing ever because I was in space.
It's not dissimilar to my inability to dock in Elite, which basically was the only thing that you needed to do. So whilst being very excited about owning the game, I could literally play it for about 30 seconds. What was the first game that you completed?
Ooh, so that's probably more recent than most people think. So there's this entire thing in the book about me having this like weird thing about not being able to complete games when I was a kid, like having fear of certain games and feelings that I wasn't good enough to finish them. Yeah, so other things happening in my life that sort of switch that. So technically the first game that I completed was Blake Stone, Agents of Gold, but also to be more technical, I didn't complete it because I didn't realize until I finished the game that actually I was playing a shareware version, so I only had a few levels and then it just kind of cut out.
That's so rubbish. I think mine was, I think it's probably Resident Evil 2.
Actually, so yeah, Resident Evil 1 could not finish it. Resident Evil 2 forced myself to finish it.
Yeah, pulled a few all-nighters doing that. That's my next question, actually, because my answer to the next question is from Resident Evil 2. But what's your favorite or most significant gaming moment?
So one which sticks out in my mind is Gears of War 3. I think it's 3. It's either 2 or 3. I'm pretty sure it's 3. So there's a moment in that it sort of cuts to a cutscene where you're in bad shape, right? You're surrounded by alien monsters and it doesn't look like you're going to get out. And one of your teammates runs off. And then he comes back like 10 minutes later in a massive truck. And it sort of slows down into this really heartfelt thing where he kind of sacrifices himself by driving this truck into a load of cans of oil or something and blowing up all the monsters to save you. But he's like driving down, he's like, oh, I never thought it would happen like this. Hey, Maria. And Maria's his dead wife. And he's like, oh, he's going to be with his wife soon. And they do it in slow motion to Mad World by Gary Jules. And I mean, nice. I was devastated after that. I had stopped playing the game for a bit because I was in floods of tears because it was so poignant.
Lovely. Mine was when you first see the liquor in the Raccoon City police station. So it wasn't terribly moving. I basically just soiled myself.
Can I tell you the reason why I didn't finish Resident Evil quickly? So the reason that I didn't finish Resident Evil was that I was playing it at home I would have been what, like 14, I think. I was playing at home, and it was like stereotypical dark night, thundering outside, raining. I was on my own at like 11 o'clock at night on a Friday night, playing it in a completely pitch black room in the dining room. And all of a sudden, I hear a creak behind me, and I turn around, and the back door is open, and it's just creaking ever so slightly open. And I have never turned on all of the lights in my house so quickly at that point, and I didn't play it for weeks after that.
Yeah, that's completely understandable. All right, quickly, game that you are best at.
Mario Kart.
I have played you at Mario Kart, and I can't argue with that. Game that utterly defeated you.
Oh, life. 2020.
2020. All right, what is the?
I was always terrible at Civilization. Civilization.
Oh yeah, me too.
Suck at. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. What is, and it's a ridiculous question, but imagine this is Desert Island Discs, and we've given you the however many games you can take to the desert island, along with Mario Kart and I don't know, Red Dead Redemption 2 as the complete works of Shakespeare and the Bible. What is the one game that you would save should a tidal wave come up?
So, I mean, the lame obvious answer, I guess, would probably be something like World of Warcraft, because it's so huge. I don't think you'd ever get bored of playing it. I'd maybe take Mario Kart, but if I was on my own, that'd be a bit lame. That is a really good question. I think I would take Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice choice.
It is, if not very close to, the greatest game ever made, I think. So,
look, on that, I bid you farewell. The book, it is excellent.
Much.
Please do buy it. It's absolutely superb. Lost in a Good Game. Professor Pete Etchells, thank you so much.
Thank you.